The Believer's Agenda for Nigeria and Politics in the Midnight Years. We salute all yoke fellows in the faith and God-fearing citizens of Nigeria and pray that His divine grace will grant you the wisdom, patience, and understanding to hear God with clarity and serve Jesus Christ with sincerity. Today we will begin to address the issue of the believer's agenda for Nigeria, as opposed to the alarms that have been raised about the Islamist takeover agenda for Nigeria. Our teachers of old used to say that you have prepared to fail when you fail to prepare. The failure of the body politic of Christians in Nigeria to announce a lucid and clear righteous agenda has in the past created much confusion, generated unnecessary fears, and weakened the church and the nation by extension. It must first of all be made clear that the believer's agenda for Nigeria must be dictated by the plans of God for our nation Nigeria and the purpose for which it was created. Secondly, we must take note that we are talking about the believer's agenda, not just the Christian religious agenda, as there is a wide difference, as one involves faith while the other is limited to religious terrestrial reasoning. Thirdly, the believer's agenda must by self-definition be pure, gentle, easy to absorb, full of mercy, full of good fruits, with no partiality, and devoid of hypocrisy. Fourthly, we must ensure that the believer's agenda must not be generated by strife or exaggerations, sensual envies, devilish motivations for revenge. You see, having laid down these divine guardrails for the believer's agenda for Nigeria, we must make it known that there is nothing new about such things, as several generations of believers before us were equipped with well-articulated documents spelling out irresistible agendas. In setting the believer's agenda for our generation, we must be careful not to engage the lens of hatred and bigotry, which have the reputation of blinding the visions of men. In crafting the believer's agenda for modern Nigeria, we must utilize divine truths that are a part of our history. For good example, Tafawa Balewa, the first Prime Minister of Nigeria, spoke prophetically at the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 7th of October in 1960. And he used diplomatic skills to announce that there would be religious conflicts and political disagreements in the decades ahead, but concluded by advising us to embrace eternal truths as the platform on which we could find lasting peace. If God spoke to the mad prophet through a donkey, we must not despise any voice that God has chosen to use to counsel Nigeria. It is clear that Tafawa Balewa discerned the centrifugal time bombs that were packaged into the foundation of Nigeria. These same forces later claimed his life and spilled his blood on the streets of our nation. To lay a foundation for the believer's agenda for Nigeria, there are several issues that must be well discussed, well interrogated, to avoid a demonic hijack or a satanic hijack of the agenda. An unnamed wise man's quote says, "Robbed of the past, you will settle for any future." This maxim is the reason why the Bible contains the records of the Old Testament, even though we are designated today as able ministers of the New Testament. Looking back, we must make it clear that the concept of a nation called Nigeria, or any black African nation for that matter, started out as an idea in the hearts of fellow believers on other continents. In the days of human slavery, the African continent was completely devastated by the cruel plague that devalued human worth and allowed Christians to be viewed as cattle that were sold and bought. One of our statesmen in Nigeria, Obafemi Awolowo, said, and I quote, "From the beginning of recorded history, the black man has been the most conspicuous butt of all manner of inhuman treatment. In the palaces of the Arabian potentates, both in the Middle East and in North Africa, he was degraded and enslaved. When the so-called dark continent of Africa was discovered, the European marauders hunted him down like a common beast, captured him, and sold him into slavery in the Americas and the West Indies. The era of trading in and enforcing the black slaves was terminated only to be replaced by the European powers, which initiated it with a legalized form of political and economic enslavement of the entire black peoples of the continent of Africa. The scramble for Africa, as well as the permanent settlement of Europeans in certain parts of Africa, was motivated wholly and solely and without any redeeming feature by the political, economic, and military self-interest of the European powers which engaged in that unholy adventure. At the time, the idea of a passport-carrying black citizen of any African nation did not exist. The slave trade was extremely prosperous, and the highest price for the Arab slavers were paid for virgin maidens from Africa. In the case of Europeans, they preferred healthy, strong, young black males suitable for plantation work. Africa is yet to say thank you to the generations of white Christians who argued on our behalf that we were also human and not half beasts, as was reported then. Good Christian men of great conscience battled nations and used the scriptures to prove that Africans were equally human as any other race on the globe. There was a period of history when the only way a black man could enter most foreign nations was as a slave in chains. The fourth verse of the Nigerian national anthem refers to the labors of our heroes past, and this represents the sacrifices made by many to birth and nurture our nation Nigeria. Modern Nigerian citizens will never truly understand how far back this list of heroes past goes, because the modern generations have very little memory of the days of human slavery, and such history is not taught to our children in the schools. Those were days when the globe was not ready to accommodate the idea of black African nations ruled by Africans as co-equals with other races of the world. If Nigeria and Africa wanted to be true to history, our gratitude should start with the abolitionists who fought a long and hard battle against their own kind to restore dignity to the black skin color from the depraved depths of human slavery. The list of our heroes past cannot start with the names of Nnamdi Azikiwe, Tafawa Balewa, Ahmadu Bello, Obafemi Awolowo, and their generation, but groups like the Christian Quakers who started objecting against the notion that Africans were subhuman entities in a state of evolution. Following hard on their heels were the men who fought nations with weapons of non-violence to persuade them that human slave trade in blacks was an evil to their own souls. Men like Henry Venn, William Wilberforce, Thomas Fowell Buxton, Graville Sharp, and the long list of faithfuls who fought till abolition was signed into law in 1807 in Britain. Striving for over 6 decades, they kept going until the human slave trade was completely outlawed as a crime in 1833. The Clapham sect lobbied the British government until the British Navy sent ships to patrol African waters to intercept any slave galleon that set sail. They even bought land in Africa to resettle freed slaves and wrote the blueprint to replace slavery with trade, commerce, and agriculture. These were the people who planted the idea of self-ruled African nations with passport-carrying citizens of their future. These Christian men and women prepared the first believers' agenda that eventually produced the nation of Nigeria. Human slavery is the worst form of corruption ever, and corruption fought back to prevent the end of human slavery in Africa. Corruption did not cherish the idea of a nation of blacks like Nigeria because of their financial profits and racial oppression advantages. But the scriptures in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 was the seed that they could not kill. Bible says, and I quote, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and every other creeping thing that creeps in the earth." This is the root scripture that forged the believer's agenda that produced Nigeria. And it is a truth, an eternal truth, that cannot be disputed, as neither the Arabs, Europeans, nor even their African partners in crime wanted slave trade to come to an end. When corruption could not stop the force in the hearts of God-fearing men, it began to reinvent itself in other forms. Again, Obafemi Awolowo noted, and I quote, "In 1885, the imperialist powers concerned assembled in Berlin to settle their differences over Africa by determining the final share out among them of its vast territory and peoples. The resulting allocations were arbitrary and the boundaries drawn were artificial. For more than 60 years thereafter, Black Africa suffered under the grinding heels of alien conquerors and settlers. Today, for most parts of Black Africa, the inhuman, humiliating, and degrading position delineated above remains, more or less the same. In this connection," he went on to say later, "our continent is now plagued by the paradox of a collection of states, many of them small and some of them none too viable, which are ostensibly independent, but which in reality are far from being genuinely free or sovereign." End quote. This observation was made on the 28th of June in 1961 and still stands true today as it was then. The core of corruption supplied by human enslavement has kept reinventing itself since then to keep Nigerians and Africans also in perpetual bondage. As we mentioned the conscientious white heroes who cleared the path for the creation of African states till Nigeria was born, the picture would not be complete without our African trailblazers whose contributions were of no less importance. At the forefront of the battle for the creation of Nigeria, we had men like Olaodua Ekiano, an Igbo slave boy captured at age 11. He was renamed Gustavus Vassa. By dint of sheer force of his personality and divine providence, this well-educated Igbo slave learned how to read and write with great excellence, and then managed to purchase his own freedom in 1776 with the cooperation of a Quaker who bought him for that purpose. Ikiano worked with Granville Sharp later on to pursue justice for freed slaves, and he became a prominent member of the Sons of Africa, a group of 12 black men who were dedicated to abolition, publishing letters in newspapers, writing petitions, and championing the cause of the black poor in London. He also worked to settle many slaves in Sierra Leone, freed slaves, but his greatest exploit by far was the publish of the book titled The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Ikiano. His portrait in the book frontispiece depicts him holding an open Bible to Acts chapter 4 verse 12. And this bestseller, published in 1789, was translated into several languages, including Russian, German, and Dutch in 1794. You see, time nor space will not permit us to mention all the landmark contributions of this great Igbo man, whose life is perhaps a prophetic capture of the African mandate of the Igbo cultural nation. Another great African that contributed to the believers' agenda to establish the Nigerian nation was Samuel Ajayi Crowther, who, like Ikiano, was captured by Fulani herdsmen in his homestead in 1821, about the age of 11 years, and sold into slavery. He was saved by the British warship the Myrmidon and taken to Freetown, where his destiny began to unfold. Like Olaudah Ikiano, his conversion experience to the Christian faith was documented in writing. His exploits and academic legacy paved the way for modern Nigeria. These were the men who worked and served before they passed the baton on to others. The Association for the Betterment of the African Race was the first supra-tribal organization in Nigeria, with the intention of advancing the cause of the African race. Then, the Society for the Promotion of Religion and Education in Lagos was formed on October the 1st, 1873. The society was constituted by all the African clergy and prominent laymen in the church, totaling 108 in number. Their aim was to render the European missionaries redundant, so that the CMS might withdraw them, because the missionaries had not been working in the interest of African independence, which the newly formed society was determined to achieve. J.P.L. Davies was elected as president, C.B. Macaulay as vice president, and Charles Forsyth as secretary. In 1879, Robert Campbell and Nathaniel King founded the Lagos Mutual Improvement Society, which regularly held public debates and lectures. J. Otumba Payne, J. S. Lay, Henry Johnson, J. A. Savage, all of them were James Johnston's supporters, Reverend James Johnston's supporters, and James Johnson himself formed the Lagos Literary and Industrial Institute in 1896 with the aim of fostering the intellectual life of Nigeria by establishing an embryo university where technical education and the arts would both be taught. Otumba Payne founded the Lagos Civil Servants Prayer Union in 1887. He was the first African member of the Civil Servants Prayer Union of Britain, founded in 1872. The Nigerian journey to statehood produced many others that we cannot list for time and space. It is important that we make it known that Nigeria would not exist today were it not for the lucid believers' agenda that agitated for its concept and formation. The believers' agenda for Nigeria began to weaken in the days of Herbert Macaulay, the grandson of Bishop Ajayi Crowther, when the basic requirements of purity, gentleness, mercy, impartiality, and other virtues drawn from eternal truths were compromised for political considerations. The foolish doctrine injected by the colonial opinion, saying that politics was so dirty that believers should not be involved, also eroded our Christian heritage in the contentions, that is politics, that shaped the following years. A spark of hope arose in the days of the CSSM, the Christian Students' Social Movement, birthed in 1976 by Austin Chimdi Ukachi, who was stirred by God to mobilize Christian students all over Nigeria to pray for the nation and engage in social action to enthrone the will of God in the land and to embark on evangelism, especially in the rural areas. Encouraged and supervised by S.G. Elton, this ember could not revive the full force of spiritual fire required to provide a lasting, lucid, and powerful believers' agenda for Nigeria. Here and there, God has inspired many more believers, but nothing could stem the tide of evil that had already hijacked the earlier efforts. Now we will conclude the first installment of the Believer's Agenda for Nigeria on this note of caution. The Believer's Agenda for Nigeria that will succeed cannot be produced with the fire brigade approach that has been branded as the Nigerian way. A few years ago, God gave us the names of certain saints in this country and God-fearing men who were a part of His agenda. And by the grace of God, we shall keep praying that the Almighty will keep them alive to fulfill their roles in the divine agenda for Nigeria that is now unfolding. On our part, we shall be as thorough and detailed as possible to bring you the guidelines for the believer's agenda for Nigeria, trusting that those who belong to God recognize His voice and will not be lured into emotional and devilish traps that Satan has unleashed in these last days. Through faith and patience, we believe that God's will in Nigeria shall be established. We must not faint because the loud bangs and noises reporting across the land are nothing but the death throes of an old order. When the dust settles, a new dawn will arise, and God's glory will fill our nation. Till then, we urge you to remain steadfast in prayer and strong in courage. When the history of Nigeria and Africa is being reviewed in the future, it will be on record that it was not the federal government, not the redentist threats of IPOB and others, not the savage violence of Boko Haram or the Fulani headsmen, nor even the agitations of the civil societies, but it will be on record that it was the consensuous stand of God-fearing citizens that ended up deciding our fate. In closing, we must not forget the admonition of Tafawa Balewa to embrace only eternal truths, and remember also the sacrifice of Malam Ibrahim, who lived in Kano in the latter part of the 19th century, as the late 1800s, and he was executed at the Kano market by the Emir of Kano for his extreme belief in Jesus Christ. While studying the Quran, Ibrahim took special note of the references to Isa, to Jesus, and according to him, I determined to make a careful study right through the Quran and collect all references to the Prophet Jesus. Who is this of whom our own Prophet writes? Can this be a man like the others mentioned in our sacred book? Ibrahim's followers remained Muslims and were called Isawas because of their belief and reverence of Jesus Christ. Let us remember him today as we strive for an equitable nation where human life will be respected, given its value, and religious freedoms will be guaranteed without fear or favor.
Macedonian Initiative started out as a national Christian faith-based watchdog, having noted that roughly 40 incidents of so-called religious disturbances had occurred between 1987 and the year 2000, resulting in the loss of thousands of lives in northern Nigeria. Following the devastating attacks in the northern city of Kaduna in February and May 2000, the Macedonian Initiative was formulated to create a bridge for Christians in the southern part of the country to offer succor and a hand of fellowship to their northern brethren. Vision statement. Inspired by divine visitations, communicating that further terror attacks lay ahead, the Macedonian Initiative set out to apply the mind of Christ to the situation, using the wisdom that is better than weapons of war, by provision of relief aid to victims across all divides of tribe, faith, and tongue, administering trauma counsel with women and children given priority, applying strategic thought, the mind of Christ, to manage and resolve conflicts. All based on the example of the Macedonian call in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1 to 4, with our guiding principle extracted from Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 18, wisdom is better than weapons of war. Mission statement. Working with partners in southern Nigeria, the Macedonian Initiative maintains mission workers in the terror fields of northern Nigeria who work to set up aid distribution and relief centers in the fields of terror, provide counseling services in the mission fields, provide transportation to Medicare services, evacuate children from the terror fields, extract persons of interest from terror fields when needful, research and collate terror-related information, provide training workshops on early warning mechanisms, pursue advocacy and out-of-the-box solutions in conflict resolution. Our strategic stealth policy. The Macedonian Initiative is today, by policy, an iceberg because of the peculiarities of the Nigerian situation. After the public opening at the Mozon Center in the year 2000, most of our activities have been low-key due to the peculiar modus operandi of the Nigerian security institutions.